Could Toronto home prices fall anytime soon? That's what we're going to chat about today. My name is John Passalis, president at Realosophy Realty. You can catch all my latest writings on Toronto's housing market at movesmartly.com. If you find this video helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe to stay up to date on all my latest videos. So my last video, I talked about some of the factors that I think might lead to Toronto's housing market cooling down in 2022. Now, the next question, of course, I get a lot is, are prices going to fall? When are they going to fall? What does that look like? I think a lot of anxiety that a lot of buyers have is that, our price is going to fall literally the day after I buy my house. And the reality is, if you look at how housing markets cool, they typically don't turn on a dime like that. They have in the past, it's quite rare, but usually they move a lot more slowly. I kind of unpack those dynamics a little bit more in my home buying boot camp, which you can sign up for. I can't go into that today in great detail, but I'm going to chat a little bit about some of the things that we need to think about going forward as we're thinking about the housing market. Now, when we think about how the housing market is going to cool down, part of that, of course, depends on the extent to which we think that the dynamics in the housing markets today are completely rational and just a product of no supply, which is a lot of economists are arguing, versus, to what extent is part of this growth we're seeing not rational, this exuberance in the market. The Bank of Canada calls it extrapolative expectations pushing home prices up. So, I think it's always best to, hope for the best and plan for the worst. So, let's just assume that, the Bank of Canada's concerns about these bubble-like symptoms in the housing market are valid. So what does it look like and what do we keep an eye out for if that is in fact happening? Now, the challenge, of course, is that if that is true, it's almost impossible to predict how the housing market is going to change. This is a quote from economist Paul Samuelson from the 1950s, and he said, "Every bubble is someday pricked, but I've long been struck by the fact and puzzled by it too, that in all the arsenal of economic theory, you have absolutely no way of predicting how long a bubble will last. And to say that prices will fall back to earth after they reach ridiculous heights represents a safe but empty prediction. Why do some manias end when prices have become ridiculous by 10%, while others persist until they are ridiculous to the tune of hundreds of a percent?" And I think this is a very interesting quote because it really highlights that these things are impossible to predict. And the reason it's impossible to predict when they're going to slow down, because these types of periods are really driven by, the beliefs and the optimism of or partly driven by certainly the beliefs and the optimism that home prices are going to keep going up forever effectively. Now, when we think about when they're going to slow down, it's really about trying to predict when those beliefs change. When people start thinking, this is too high, they can't go up much higher, and they have a more cautious feeling about the direction of housing prices. And then eventually when that caution turns to pessimism are the key things that sort of leads to home prices falling, right? So we can kind of see this if we rewind the clock to Toronto's market in 2016 and 2017. We had a rapidly accelerating bubbly housing market with prices rising 30% per year. And then suddenly prices fell 20%, and they fell 20% not because of any economic or fundamental reason, but because the province had suggested that they're going to introduce a foreign buyers tax in Ontario. And we had the benefit of seeing how that impacted BC's housing market when they introduced one a year earlier, and it actually put downward pressure on house prices in Vancouver. So a lot of people saw that the foreign buyers tax would do the same thing in Ontario, and it actually changed beliefs from optimistic to pessimistic virtually overnight. And that's really what triggered a decline in prices. So when we think about what are the key things we want to look at going forward, certainly I feel like understanding and keeping an eye on some of the beliefs that are driving the housing market are critical, because as those things change, then we basically start to see tipping points in the housing market, and a lot of different things that can shift beliefs, both from beliefs, either public policy or even just the sentiment of buyers and investors on the ground. Now, I will add, there's this great quote I find from David Rosenberg, I'm trying to pull it up now, who often says, that bubbles will last longer than you think, but they don't correct by going sideways. So again, when we think about why they'll last longer than you think, this really stems from the fact that they can just keep going. They're almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And sometimes in the case of the housing market, we have actually public policy, both monetary and fiscal, that are actually pushing house prices up higher, right? Now, when he talks about they don't correct sideways, what he means by that is that, this idea a lot of people have is like, okay, we might hit this sort of soft landing when home prices plateau. That typically doesn't happen after rapid accelerations, because if we think about some of the factors that are leading investors to spend the money that they're spending on the properties that they're buying, they're all rooted in this expectation that prices will be higher tomorrow. Like the reason a pre-construction condo investor pays 30% more than an existing resale unit is because they believe it's going to be worth significantly more tomorrow, right? The reason an investor buys a rental property that they need to spend $1,500 a month out of their own pockets just because the rent doesn't cover their carrying costs, they do that because they think it's going to be worth a lot more tomorrow. So even if prices plateau, this starts making a lot of investors think, well, why am I doing this? Why am I, overpaying for these pre-construction properties? Why am I paying $1,500 a month for a property that's not going to be worth any more 5 years from now? So these sort of leveling off periods tend to not last long, and that's why you start to see sort of a dip in home prices once beliefs turn from pessimistic, sort of from optimistic to pessimistic. Now, is that going to happen anytime soon? I think I mentioned in my last video that I don't think it's going to happen in 2022. I think the federal government still has too many tools to keep the housing market going. I think just given with the economy being less stable still due to COVID, that they're probably going to do everything possible to keep it going. But, I think it's still important to sort of keep an eye on some of these dynamics. If we start to see the market cooling down this summer, if we start to see beliefs changing, these are some of the things that I think are important to keep an eye on, because the key thing is that once beliefs sort of start tipping from optimist to neutral to pessimist, well, these are the things that the federal government can't do anything about, because the second people turn pessimistic, it doesn't matter how much debt the federal government allows first-time homebuyers to take on, they're going to be reluctant to take on more debt if they think we're in a declining housing market. Again, I personally I would be surprised if we see any signs like that anytime soon, but I think it's important as buyers to kind of keep an eye on some of these dynamics, because to me, these are some of the early signs when we start to see the market turning from very exuberant to again, sort of a more neutral and cautious market. And the big red flag is to start looking for potentially pessimism on the ground. And I think these factors, when we're dealing with the type of market we have today, are probably going to give us more clues in where house prices are going to be tomorrow versus any sort of macroeconomic model or variable. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below or send me an email at askjohn@movesmartly.com.